Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all the attendees who have joined this very important programs on the guidelines on caveat limitations and disclosures. And this program is being organized by the ICAI Registered Valuer Organization as part of the run-up to the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. Today we have with us a very distinguished panel, and we have with us Mr. Rajesh Kumar Gupta ji, who is the Chief General Manager with the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. And we also have CA Parag Kulkarni, who apart from the Indian Chartered Accountant, he's also a CPA from US and a member of the England and Wales Institute as well. So I think the topic, as you know, is very contemporary and very challenging. Challenging in the sense that if we look at the concept of valuation as such, it for time immemorial, it has been existing, and valuation of the corporate entities or any other kind of movable or immovable property, that was always in vogue. But what has happened is with the big ticket changes happening and the movement of the state controlled economy getting transitioned to the market economy, the conception of the valuation which was required under various enactments, whether the banking or the FEMA or the wealth tax, or the valuation being required for various regulatory compliances. Even if one had to arrange or mobilize the fundings, or whether in the IPO market or going for the banking financing, the conception of valuation always came into play. And what has recently happened is while the market always used to determine the price of an asset, and the valuation being a simulated exercise, the valuers were making recourse to many hypotheses and assumptions while they were coming out a price which is near to the market price. With the coming up of the Companies Act 2013, we have seen that the Section 247 has made the statutory obligation that wherever the valuation is required to be made in respect of specified classes of assets under the Companies Act, or net worth or liability, or under the IBC proceedings, they are required to be done by a registered valuer. So for the very first time, we had the conception of a regulated profession of a valuer, and the provisions were invoked on 18th of October 2017, when the enforcement of the notification for enforcement of Section 247, as well as the company's registered valuer and rules 2017, that also came into play. Now, what has become important is that the business obsolences, whether arising out of the changes in technology or the new form of business structures coming up, or merger and acquisitions, or valuation of intangibles. So what is happening is, in statistics, you would have heard about the conception of what do you call the type 1 and type 2 errors. So while you are trying to do a mark-to-market valuation, the fair valuation, the concept of valuation for an ongoing concern and for liquidation. So maybe what you are trying to do is you are trying to revive a firm which is revivable, and trying to which is not going to be revivable. So a wrong valuation will result into the type 1 and type 2 errors, and valuation being a mixture of a science and art, depending upon the valuation and the approaches and methods and the standards being followed. So I think the topic is very interesting. I would cut short my brief remarks for now, and I would introduce the chief guest for today, our Chief General Manager with IBBI, Rajesh Kumar Gupta ji, who has very kindly consented to give perspective of the regulator on what all is the expectation of IBBI from the registered valuers and the accountants in general while they take up the valuation exercise. So with these words, over to you, Rajesh Gupta ji.
Thank you. Sir, before you start, I would like to give one information. We have 4,000 people live with us, and we also have participants from US, Canada, New Zealand, UAE. Not Great. Only from India, we have across the world, we have from these countries as of now live with us. You may please continue.
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Rakesh Sehgal, MD, ICAI RVO, Ms. Sarika Singhal, CEO, ICAI RVO, CA Parag Kulkarni, and all the distinguished participants within India and abroad. A very good afternoon and maybe a good morning to all of you. I would like to thank ICAI RVO for inviting me to be the chief guest on this webinar, Guidelines on Caveats, Limitations and Disclaimers. This is a very apt moment for this particular topic to be discussed and understood among the registered valuers community in the country, specifically because the topic is not well understood and it is detrimental both for the registered valuers as also the users of the valuation services. As we are aware, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016 has been in operation for just over 5 years and has already started giving several useful outcomes since its inception. From providing freedom of exit to rescuing companies in financial distress, to helping creditors realize their dues, and most importantly, bringing about a behavioral change among the debtors and the creditors alike, while reinforcing the rule of law, the list of achievements of the code is a long one. From Synergy Dure, the first company resolved through a resolution plan, to the most protracted and a long resolution of SR Steel, the story is compelling. Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016 has put in place effective tools for creditors to successfully negotiate and effectuate higher chances to realize their dues in significantly reduced time frame as also the expenses as compared to the earlier insolvency regimes which are prevailing in the country. The code provides for a slew of service providers who are professionals to facilitate various processes under the law. They are mandated to make market processes fair, effective, transparent to achieve the overall objectives enshrined under the code. While the code has created certain new professions and associated institutions, it has also reinvented a few others, including the registered valuers. The profession of valuation has a very long history in the country. The profession is developed as an independent, multidisciplinary profession over the years. The importance of valuation in the market economy cannot be understated. A credible and reliable valuation of the assets is a prerequisite for orderly functioning of an economic market. A market economy relies heavily on the value of underlying assets while finalizing and taking various crucial economic decisions. For undertaking plethora of crucial economic decisions, that is under the Companies Act, IBC, SEBI Act, Income Tax Act, and even for non-statutory purposes like valuations for the banks and the financial institutions. Valuation, as we are all aware, is both an art as well as a science. The valuation of an asset is an estimate of the worth of an asset, which is arrived at after factoring in multiple parameters and externalities. This may not be the actual price of that asset, and the market may discover a different price for that asset. Sometimes different registered valuers arrive at different estimates of the same asset. While this may be possible when the purposes of valuation are different, such variance is often observed even when the purposes as also the circumstances in which the valuation is being carried out are the same. In such a situation, the market may sometimes question the ability of the registered valuers and the integrity of the entire valuation process. This, of course, we all appreciate is not in the best interest of the stakeholders, where crucial economic and commercial decisions are to be taken based on the content and the number contained in the valuation reports. We all would appreciate that the relationship between the valuer and other stakeholders predominantly rests on the trust. The decision maker hold their immense trust on the valuation provided by the valuers to undertake important financial decisions. Therefore, it becomes immensely important that the ownership of valuation report remains strongly and completely with the valuer. The confidence of the valuer in his valuation report is essential to maintain and reinforce the confidence of users of valuation services in the valuation report. Caveats are warnings or cautions to the user of services, while limitations arise if the registered valuer is unable to obtain sufficient information and explanations which he may consider necessary for the purpose of the valuation. Where such limitations may result in the registered valuer being unable to carry out the valuation in accordance with the normal approach to valuation, the valuation report shall be modified with a paragraph setting out the nature of circumstances giving rise to this limitation. A disclaimer is a statement intended to specify or delimit the scope of rights and obligations that may be exercised and enforced by the parties in a legally recognized relationship. A disclaimer is required in a valuation report to mitigate the potential risks which the RV may face. However, a valuation report should not carry a disclaimer which has potential to dilute the responsibility of the valuer or make the valuation unsuitable for the purpose for which the valuation is being conducted. The valuation reports should be capable of being tested through the crucible of legal evidence in judicial proceedings. While caveat, limitations, and disclaimers have different connotations, these may be used in an interchangeable manner, as limitation or disclaimer by a registered valuer can actually be a caveat for the user of a report. In order to bring about some objectivity and standardization in the valuation reports, the company's Registered Valuer and Valuation Rules 2017 very aptly deals with the conduct of valuation by the registered valuers, and the Rule 8 provides that a valuer has to follow the valuation standards notified by the government, or till such time these valuation standards are notified by the government, the valuation standards adopted by the registered valuer organizations have to be utilized. The provision also details the mandatory content in a valuation report, be it the background information of the asset, purpose of the valuation, or the appointing authority, etc. The provision also mandates disclosure of any conflict of interest, the caveats, limitations, and disclaimers in the valuation report. However, the same shall only be to the extent that they explain or elucidate the limitations faced by the valuer, and shall not be for the purpose of limiting his responsibility of the valuation report. So most important thing which comes out is the valuer should not be actually putting out such kind of caveats, limitations, or disclosures which actually take away the ownership of the report and maybe lessen or remove the accountability from him for the report which he has submitted. The rule aims to ensure that the valuation report does not carry a disclaimer which has the potential to dilute the responsibility of the registered valuer or to make the valuation unsuitable for the purpose for which the valuation is conducted. So many times there have been instances wherein large number of caveats, disclaimers, etc. put down in a manner that the user is not able to rely upon that kind of a report which has been submitted with the registered valuer, and he cannot really with certainty or a degree of certainty rely upon that number, the valuation number which is contained in the report, and accordingly the kind of decisions which he may have to take based on such report become either faulty or they are not able to, the user is not able to take such decisions because of large number of caveats, limitations, etc. which are inbuilt, and according to which the accountability of the registered valuer is lowered. The usage and scope of caveats, limitations, and disclaimers was, however, not clear to the stakeholders, as I was mentioning even earlier also, including the users and the registered valuers. And consequently, the registered valuers are utilizing varying practices in presentations of caveats, limitations, and disclaimers in their valuation reports. Some people were using few kind of forms of these caveats, limitations. Some were not using them at all. Some were using caveats limitation in a manner which was very detrimental to the entire profession. And to accordingly to dispel any kind of ambiguity, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, being the authority under the valuation rules, came up with the guidelines on use of the caveats, limitations, and disclaimers by the registered valuers in their valuation reports by way of a circular dated 1st of September 2020. The guidelines are divided into 3 sections. They're very elaborate guidelines. The first of the sections elaborates the need for caveats, limitations, and disclaimers. The second section provides a guidance note on the use of caveats, limitations, and disclaimers, while the third section provides an illustrative list of the caveats, limitations, disclaimers for each asset class provided in the rules. We have 3 asset classes, of course, you are aware in terms of the asset classes provided in the rules, whether land and building, securities or financial assets, or plant and machinery. So for each of these asset classes, the illustrative list of caveats, limitations, and disclaimers are provided as part of these guidelines, which have been issued by the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. I urge all the registered valuers to thoroughly understand these guidelines and utilize these in the conduct of their day-to-day valuations. I also request all the users of the valuation services to peruse the guidelines, have a good understanding, to have a better assessment of the valuation reports which are provided to them. And I'm quite hopeful that adherence to these guidelines, the registered valuers ecosystem, would provide comfort to all the stakeholders and further strengthen their trust and reliability of the valuation services provided by the registered valuers. This would also lead to enhanced kind of a respectability for the profession. This is an opportune time for all of us to discuss various issues and concerns surrounding subject matter. We have an excellent speaker, resource person by way of Mr. Kulkarni, and this would also help us in further improving our existing understanding of the subject matter. Let us make best use of this opportunity provided by the ICAI RVO. And in the end, I would like to thank ICAI RVO again to provide us with an opportunity to present our views and for me to be a chief guest onto this webinar. And I wish the webinar a big success. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta ji, for sharing this perspective and explaining about a macro view of what all the guidelines on caveat limitations and disclaimers they talk about, and what is the perspective of regulator and the background which had given rise to coming out with these guidelines. And you had very rightly stated that the subject is complex and it needs to be understood in detail. And I think the way the jurisprudence around this subject has emerged and the number of CIRP cases which have been tackled so far, so that demonstrates the ability of the registered valuers and maturity of the professionals to come out to the expectations on the regulatory front, because we have always regarded this as a public interest profession, something which is trying to do with the serenity of the financial ecosystem as such. Because while there would be flailing entities, there would be competing entities, and a mix of these entities gives rise to, and along with the technological changes, and who would have seen that the COVID-19, something as disastrous as the global financial market meltdown, which happened in 2008, and in last 12 years, we have seen this second catastrophic event, which had brought in significant vulnerability and uncertainty in the financial system. And with that lies not only a threat, but an opportunity to the profession of valuation, because the profession is maturing. So it no longer remains on the whims and fancies of a general evocation, because unlike other profession, it has come as a profession which is regulated, which has standards on quality control, and each of the registered valuer organization, they are monitoring the various reports which have been brought out by the registered valuers. So to that extent, the profession is doing its contribution in bringing up the resilience to a market-driven economy. So I thank you on behalf of ICAI RVO for joining this program and sharing the perspective of IBBI. And we would look forward to the contribution from IBBI in various other endeavors which are going to be taken by ICAI RVO. Thank you, Mr. Rajesh.
Of course, sir. Thanks a lot.
So we would like you to continue with us and listen to the perspective being given by CA Parag Kulkarni. And what is important is, the risk as such is always inherent, whether we talk about a general life or a financial life, and more in regard to the corporate and economic regulation, because the way the things have changed, the business uncertainty, the risk to the market risk, and the profession of valuation, what is trying to do is delinking the market risk from the valuation risk, and it is moving on the lines of adopting scientific approaches and valuation methods and procedures, so that the divergence, of course, it would always be there, because when two or more professionals, they come out, because while they are regarding the same subject matter, but the fundamental hypothesis, the assumptions, the methodologies, they may not be the same. So I think Parag in his address would like to touch upon how to reduce this divergence, and the statement made by the valuer that on the same subject matter, many a times a very significant deviation is noticed in the valuation, which is brought in by the valuers. So with these words, may I request Parag to do the honors, and over to you, Parag ji.
Thank you so much, Sehgal sir, Sarika madam, and chief guest for today's session, Gupta sir. I first of all congratulate IBBI and ICAI RVO for this knowledge dissemination series, and this is the way, it looks forward to empower its members, whether ICAI members or ICAI RVO members. Having said that, allow me to share my screen so that we will have a structured discussion for the today's topic on guidelines related to caveat, limitations, and disclaimer. Sehgal sir, if you could give me the confirmation in terms of whether my screen has been shared and is it visible to you and the participants?
Yeah, it is visible, Parag.
Excellent, thank you. I would like to lay the context before I go a little deeper, and I take this opportunity to communicate some of the grievances or some of the areas of the valuers to the Sehgal sir, and I am not referring to the exact discussions of the IBB or the insolvency, but I'll stick to the concept of the fair value and maybe the disclaimer. But look at the debacle of the Paytm that has happened. We claim that something comes as a fair value, something was undersigned as a fair value, investor assumes and perceives something to be a fair value, and then going forward the market turns around the table and then price it differently. So the fundamental question that we need to address is whether the fair value is equal to the price, and if it is not so, then how the valuer can protect himself by quoting something to be a fair value in a context, and then protect himself from the activities or the way the market participant, the way look at it going forward in its pricing subsequent to that particular event. On 1st September 2020, Gupta sir rightly quoted, the guidelines were issued by IBBI on use of caveats, limitations, and disclaimers to be by registered valuers in the valuation report. Though the supplement was issued on 1st September 2020, the rules actually became effective from 1st October 2020. And these rules will be called as Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, that is IBBI, use of caveats, limitation, and disclaimer in valuation guidelines 2020. So the company's registered valuers and valuation rules 2017 provides a comprehensive framework for development and regulation of the profession of the valuer. And these rules set standard of professional conduct and performance for the valuation profession in the interest of stakeholders. So today, the kind of line of action that we have is first to understand the background and objective of these guidelines and rules. Secondly, to discuss the need. Third is to delve into the guidance that has been given through these guidelines, and also to look at some of the examples before we end up with this conclusion. We have almost 1 hour for discussion before we open it up, last half an hour for the question and answer session. So with this, let's go into the first discussion of the background on guidelines on use of caveats, limitations, and disclaimers by registered valuers in the valuation report. So Rule 8 of the rules, which means the Rule 8 of the company's registered valuation rules 2017 mandates that registered valuer shall state. So in its report, valuers are required to state the caveats, limitations, and disclaimer to the extent that they explain or elucidate the limitations faced by the valuer, provided that the valuer is not diluting his responsibility. So the valuer should not for the purpose limit his responsibility and dilute by including some of the restrictive clauses. So this rule is primarily aimed to ensure that the valuation report does not carry a disclaimer which otherwise has a potential of diluting the absolute responsibility of the registered valuer, or maybe make that valuation report unsuitable for the purpose of which the valuation was conducted. So, however, the scope of caveat, limitation, and disclaimer is not very clear to everyone, including maybe the registered valuers and those who are appointing registered valuers. So what has happened is RVs followed different practices in presenting these caveats or defining the limitations or also articulating disclaimers in their report. In that context, IBBI constituted a committee, and it was privilege for some of the members of ICAI to be a part of that committee. And I must name Rajan Wadhwan sir, who also have been conducting a lot of sessions for the ICAI review, was a part of this committee. And along with Mr. Rajan sir, some other senior members of the profession was also part of IBBI committee, who ultimately created a standard template for such disclaimers. ICSI review also played a vital role in supporting this entire exercise. But finally, somewhere in the April 20, that is just before publication, this draft guidelines were preliminarily discussed at the back end by this committee with the IBBI, and subsequently on September, these guidelines were opened up for the public, and from October, it became effective. So what was the objective of these guidelines issued by the IBBI? Obviously, these guidelines were issued in the interest to bring the credibility on the valuation report. If one valuer claims something to be his limitation and another value is not claiming the same thing to be his limitation, then either there is a problem with the profession or the professional. We need to have a standardized processes and standardized acceptance across the board so that the quality of the valuation report can be comparable, or the conclusions of the valuation report can be comparable. Imagine a situation, one company appoints two valuers, one has a limitation in valuing that asset, and that's why it comes up with a conclusion with a limitation, and another company without any limitation concludes on another value. Then the readers or the stakeholders of the financial statements along with that valuation report should appreciate the fact that there are two different valuation, and the difference in that valuation is arising out of the limitation. I have also seen some of the codes for the merger purpose or some other scheme of merger or maybe for acquisition, they typically require, or the companies that typically require, appointment of two independent valuers. And then ultimately, consultant who is working on the structuring of the organization says that the average of these two values to be a fair value. Now, how far the averaging of two values, one with a limitation, one may not with a limitation, or maybe one with one type of limitation and another with another set of limitation, can be aggregated to calculate the average value and to be concluded to be a fair value. I think we are not using these rules in the right spirits. And that's why if there are limitations, then they need to be specifically accounted for and quantified if possible in the valuation report. Like we do for the audit report, we check the materiality, and on the basis of the significance or materiality, we say something that something is correct or something is incorrect. If something is incorrect and if the management doesn't appreciate or accept, we qualify that report. So though there is no explicit qualification of the valuation report, rather such qualification can be inserted by way of expressing the limitation through the caveats, limitations, and disclaimers. Now, a registered valuer shall prepare valuation report under the rule 8 of the valuation rules, right? And then the RVO is supposed to monitor all registered valuers for their compliances with these rules, including the guidelines for the caveats, limitations, and disclaimers. Now, Rajesh sir has already explained you the way these guidelines are compiled or the way they have been structured. There are 3 sections. First section is need, second section is the guidance, and third section is the illustrative list. Maybe at the end of the session, ICAI RVO will also send you the link of these guidelines, which you can download and refer to. So these guidelines have been prepared, like we said, in consultation with various registered valuers organization. And finally, these guidelines were reviewed by IBBI from time to time. Having said that, we are in 2021 second last quarter, and the guidance that has been issued on September and has been effective from October 20 still remains effective as of today's date. Let's now go to the definition of fair value, because we can delve into those caveats only when we apparently understand what is the meaning of fair value. So fair value, by reference to IFRS 13 or Ind AS 113, or maybe in the US GAAP section ASC 820, basically the fair value has been defined now by IASB and FASB more towards an exit price. So previously we had the definition of fair value which said that it's an arm's length price. Now you cannot see the wording like arm's length here. You cannot see the wording such as unrelated parties, because IFRS has undergone a change subsequent to the financial crisis of 2007. And then IASB and FASB came together to define the concept of fair value on the notion of exit price. So initially the IFRS 13 revised the definition of fair value, and then it defined the way you are seeing now on the screen. And subsequently, when we adopted Ind AS in India, we also adopted the new definition of fair value under Ind AS 113. Fair value has 6 critical ingredients. First, the price that would be received to sell an asset or paid to transfer a liability. In fourth ingredient is an orderly transaction. So we're not looking at the liquidation event. We're not looking at exceptional event. We're looking at the orderly transaction. Orderly transaction between the fifth ingredient, market participants at the measurement date. So the fair value is defined more from the market participants perspective, which means that if one is acquirer and second is acquiree, and both are possibly, let's say, in the same ecosystem, and that's why acquirers having synergy of acquiring the acquiring company, then possibly that synergy is attributable to specific acquirer and hence may not be a part of fair value, because fair value is defined from the market participants perspective and not from the entity specific perspective. Rather, if you are identifying a value from entity specific perspective, then you have to identify that value as a fair value, which is a transaction based value. So that fair value then can be seen in a context of that particular transaction. ICAI has also issued valuation standard, and I strongly recommend that please refer to ICAI valuation standard to know more about the basis of valuation. While you do the valuation by looking at its 6 ingredients, Ind AS 113 also give you the inputs that must be used, and the disclosure under the valuation report and also under the accounting standard, which ultimately results in disclosure as a part of your financial report, requires you to define the kind of inputs that you have used in deriving those fair value. Level 1 inputs are considered to be best inputs. And as a valuer, you must ensure that you should utilize as much observable inputs as possible, which are basically level 1 inputs. Level 1 inputs are quoted prices in an active market for identical assets or liabilities that the entity can access at the measurement date. For example, if listed company is issuing ESOP to its employees, then it refers to the listed price as the input, which is the quoted price of an active market for the identical asset, that is identical equity share. Level 2 inputs other than quoted are the inputs other than quoted prices included within the level 1 that are observable for the asset or liability either directly or indirectly. Lot many times for bonds and for derivatives, we typically have level 2 inputs. And level 3 inputs are basically the least observable inputs, or we call it as unobservable inputs for the asset or a liability. So if your valuer, if following the income method and typically you are discounting the future cash flows, then there is a high possibility that, or there is a absolute possibility that you are falling within the level 3 inputs. Now, the more less observable input, the more sensitive your valuation is. Now, though it is not directly a part of your caveat or a limitation, but you as a valuer are expected to explain this particular fact that you have used heavily on the level 3 inputs, and that's why you must also expect it to perform the sensitivity analysis, which means if the discount rate is moved by 0.5% or let's say 1%, how will it impact the fair value? If the margins are increased or decreased by 1%, and how will it impact the fair value? Let's take it forward and let's try to now understand the fair value in a context of today's key area of discussion, that is need for caveat, limitations, and disclaimers. So I have identified 9 critical areas that we must know before we write our commentary in the paragraphs of caveats, limitations, and disclaimers. Let's try to discuss a need of having these caveats, limitation, and disclaimer. So the valuation of an asset is ultimately what? It's an estimate of the worth of that asset, which is arrived at after multiplying or looking at or factoring multiple parameters and externalities. Now, this may not be the actual price of that asset, and the market may discover altogether different price of that asset. Now, look at the incidence or an event that I'm speaking. If the listed company is making further issue of shares under Section 62 of Companies Act under a private placement, question is, should we use level 1 input and say that because the market is presently valuing something at X price, that's a fair value of an entity? How right that conclusion could be? Because though the market is independent, it can be skewed. It can factor some of the perceptions and some of the challenges that participants can perceive and may ultimately feel as if it's a technological impairment or economic impairment of an organization. Look what happened when the panic flew in the market somewhere in the January to March 2020. Market collapsed. Now imagine if someone is valuing an organization on the basis of cash flows, would say that maybe the technological capabilities of the organization have not been impaired, and hence I do not foresee an impairment of an asset. Consequently, I still believe a fair value of an asset to a higher level. And what I see is not the impairment of the revenue, but a deferment of the revenue because of the COVID restrictions. But the market is panicked and it overly calculates the panic in the price. So question is, when the actual price of that asset as perceived by you as a valuer on the basis of cash flow is fundamentally different from the price that has been discovered by the market, maybe on account of so many different crises, whether you have protected yourself when you undersign that value as a fair value, and if not, how should you protect it? Look at the cryptocurrencies. Couple of days back, the Bitcoin crashed like anything. Yesterday, again, the cryptocurrencies were on the higher side. How will you value it? Can you actually value the cryptocurrency, or you can only price them? That's altogether another topic that we will have maybe in some other discussion. But if you are valuing a company, let's say located in Singapore or USA, where companies are freely dealing in these cryptocurrencies, question is, how will you write the caveats, limitations, and disclaimers when you are valuing these companies where one of the non-operating asset is a cryptocurrency? Obviously, the value of the operating assets can be attributed or identified on the basis of the cash flows. But can you value a Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency on the basis of cash flows? Obviously not. Then how will you protect yourself is the question. And hopefully by the end of this session, we'll be able to at least give you some of the directions and areas, the way in which you can protect yourself when you undersign that valuation report. Okay, having said that, the limitation arises in the registered valuer, in the registered valuer's report if he is unable to obtain what sufficient information and explanations which are considered to be necessary for the purpose of valuation, and where such limitation results in registered valuer being unable to carry the valuation in accordance with the normal approach to the valuation. And obviously I'll also discuss the typical approach that I follow in going ahead and dealing the valuation. The valuation report shall be modified with the paragraph setting out the nature of these circumstances giving rise to the limitation. And a disclaimer is required in a valuation report to what? To mitigate the risk of registered value. And obviously the reasons for providing the disclaimer in the valuation report could be: one is to protect the rights of registered valuer by cautioning or maybe dissuading others when using the contents of valuation report. And second is to limit your liability, since it will serve both purposes, one as a warning and also a way to mitigate your overall financial risk. I'll also recommend that there are certain professional insurances that are available to registered valuers, or maybe as a chartered accountant. I strongly recommend, whether you are an auditor or whether you are doing any attestation function, try to get this insurance, so that apart from disclaimer, if tomorrow any financial burden comes onto you on the basis of, or maybe the court says that you were guilty of your negligence, though you believe that you are not, at least the insurance is taking care of some of your financial liabilities going forward. A disclaimer protects registered valuer from incurring the liability or limiting the liability of registered valuer from the actions of the company or the management or even the insolvency professional at whose instruction the valuation has been carried out. If the valuation professional directs you to do certain things, obviously you will follow that rule. But if tomorrow IBBI identifies that the insolvency professional has done mishaps in his entire undertaking, obviously he will be guilty of his misconduct. But question is whether his guilt will result onto liability onto you. And obviously to limit that, you should say that my work was carried within a given framework and on the basis of information supplied, obviously without diluting, taking the ownership of defending the value that you conclude in that context. So valuation report should not carry a disclaimer which has potential to dilute the responsibility of the registered valuer, or ultimately makes that valuation unsuitable for the purpose of which it was initially conducted. So valuation reports should be capable of being tested through the crucialities of the legal evidence in the legal proceedings. Now, what critical points that typically RV should have? First is, RV should be able to identify the rights he or she wants to protect. Second is, identify the areas where he or she might be subject to the liability. Typically, when you're working closely on the insolvency engagements, you should be very cautious. I primarily work on the deal side and not on the insolvency side. That's why it's quite easy for me to give away with my liabilities, because only when the deal happens, obviously deal happens. And we have been very clear with the report that we issue or maybe the contract that we make that primarily what we are giving is the recommendation. What we are quoting is the fair value that we perceive, that we believe the market participants will believe, but ultimately you both parties are going to interact and transact between you. So the fair value is only for the purpose of your base price or maybe the higher price, and on that basis the negotiation can happen. As the conclusions that possibly I draw are not within the framework of Companies Act because they are more on the deal side, but when you do the valuation, I know that for the matter that you issue lot many reports in compliance with the Companies Act and in compliance with the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India Act. So it is very important for you to clarify that the content of the valuation report pertain to specific use by the company, and you need to caution the reader of these potential risks. However, like I said, a disclaimer will not by itself be able to exclude your liability in respect of the negligence in performance of his duties or your duties. So if you are neglected in performing a duty, if you have not analyzed the historical financial statements, can we simply say that the historical financial statements of the company were not submitted to us and that's why we are not looking into? As the company is private, historical financial statements of the company are not available publicly. You are expected to go and register on the register of companies. You are expected to pay and then get those historical records and look into it. You cannot just say that I don't have those records because they are not freely available in the public domain. Sometimes these records are available in the public domain, but you have to pay for it. And then you are expected to pay for it. And they cost negligible amount. They cost possibly just 100 rupees per company. You can add on that cost when you're billing to your client, but you cannot just include that part as a part which is limiting factor. No, it is not a limiting factor. The rules notified under Companies Act 2013 designates IBBI as an authority for development and regulation of the valuation profession. Rule 7A provides that registered valuer shall comply with such other conditions as may be imposed by IBBI because it's an authority. And Rule 831 provides that registered valuer shall include caveat, limitations, and disclaimer in the valuation report. So if you have not been including such kind of paragraphs, then I think you are at the professional negligence. So you must include this paragraph explicitly in the valuation report. They cannot be implicit. Should you include it initially, or should you include in the middle, or should you include at the end of the valuation report? It's your prerogative. I would recommend include it at the end of the report, before the annexures. So first, have the opening remarks, write the executive summary, perform the attest function, detail out the valuation, and just before the annexures, which is giving explanation of lot many calculations, you include the caveats, limitations, and disclaimers as a part of your report. So I have apparently tried covering these 9 areas. Now let me take forward and build up or explain the guidance while we drive the process driven valuations. Now I typically follow the guidance under ICAI valuation standard and international valuation standards, because I perform valuation for the compliance purpose under Indian Companies Act, under IBBI, as well as we perform compliance function as a registered valuer of India for companies in Singapore, or for companies in USA, or for companies in UK for the deal making purpose. Or even, you can go out, and a lot of work is now arising from UAE too in terms of the deal making. So having said that, what we do at the back end is we follow a process which is in line with the ICAI valuation standard. And typically, the ICAI valuation standard would want me to go through this minimum 8 steps. The first step is to identify the asset that I'm valuing. And when I mean asset, it could be a liability too. Please note that a lot of work is arising in the valuation profession from the banker side, where banker is appointing you to value the value of the liability of an entity, which means, let's say a group has borrowed from a bank, and bank says that you please go ahead and value the value of this liability because it is an asset for the banker. So whether you issue report for the bank or whether you issue report to the borrower, on the one hand side it's an asset, on the other side, on the mirror image, it's a liability. So it doesn't matter the way you look at it. It only matters in the accounting, but it doesn't matter from the valuation side, because the value that you derive from that asset from one side and the liability from other side is primarily on the basis of the cash flows, or on the basis of the comparable transaction, or on the basis of the comparable company multiples. So first you identify the asset, and you define in your valuation report what is an asset. If you are unable to define an asset, for example, I still remember in one of the engagement, it was engagement quoting the inventory including the gold. Now I was unable to identify that asset because I was not the right person, first of all, to do the valuation of gold. So I had to hire an expert. And then he believed that he is unable to identify that asset because he could not visit and physically check whether it was truly gold or not. In the books of accounts, they called it as a gold, but we don't know because of the COVID and other restrictions, we could not go. So we said that, okay, the assets that are identifiable as a part of this merger are A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And assets which we were unable to identify were so much. So many different assets we were not able to identify. Sometimes inventories which are located at various branches or remote places, if you can't visit, then you must say that I have not identified that asset. Or if, let's say, there is fire or there's issue with respect to the going concern, if there's a destruction of the property, and then you have been appointed by an insurance company to perform that valuation, then you must say that, okay, only these assets were identifiable and these assets were not identifiable at all, though they were insured. And your report should explicitly identify assets which were identifiable and which were not identifiable. Now, secondly, once you identify those assets which remain a part of your valuation report, then you define the scope of work around it. Whether the scope is for the compliance purpose or scope is for the deal making purpose. Thirdly, perform the analysis, the nature of an asset, the feature of an asset, the tangible and intangible assets. If it's an intangible asset, like a customer relationships, can you do the valuation for the internal reporting purpose? Could be, but then you cannot account for it. But if another company is acquiring the other company, obviously you need to do that. And please note that if you have to value even a one intangible asset such as brand, you are expected to do the valuation of all the assets, because until you do that, you cannot have the reconciliation between VARA and WACC. WACC is weighted average cost of capital, which is typically the discount rate that you use for valuing the intangible asset, and VARA is weighted average return on asset. And as a part of a valuation report of any intangible asset, you have to perform and give the reconciliation between WACC and VARA, which basically requires you to perform valuation of all assets, though you have been appointed to do the valuation of a single intangible asset. So identifiable asset is one asset. The scope of work includes the valuation of many others around it, because the analysis and valuation requires you to do the VARA and WACC analysis. Now, ultimately, the valuation base. Is it a fair value? Is it a market participant specific value or a liquidation value? Like I said, if you believe that you are doing a valuation in terms of acquiring another company, and then the synergies must be valued in that deal value, it's a market participant specific value, and it is not a fair value. Can you undersign a market participant specific value as IBBI registered valuer? Answer is yes. ICAI valuation rules allows you to undersign fair value, allows you to undersign market participant specific value, and allows you to undersign the liquidation value. So you have already been empowered to identify a particular value either as a fair value, market participant specific value, or liquidation value, provided you mention and then you quote that, okay, these are the limiting factors for you to convert that market participant specific value into a fair value, or a liquidation value into a fair value. Taking it forward, then ultimately you choose the valuation approach. Either you choose the income approach, market approach, or cost approach. Often, and as ICAI valuation standard says, you have been recommended to use more than one approach. Rather, it is expected that you apply more than one approach. Typically, I follow the income and market approach for most of the going concern companies. If it's an intangible asset, then obviously it could be a combination of all three approaches. And if it's a non-going concern company, it could be a combination of a market and cost approach. Finally, once the approach has been identified, we perform the modeling, and then many assumptions go inside. And while we take those assumptions on the cash flow basis and discounting rates, obviously the question is whether the management is supplying you with the right kind of information. And if they're not, then that becomes the limiting factor. Or if the management is giving you certain information, assume that you have been appointed to do the derivative valuation. Now, the derivative is dependent upon the LIBOR. And if all of you are aware, the LIBOR cessation is happening in December 2021, which means post December 2021, the valuer needs to imagine what rate could be used in order to value those derivatives, because LIBOR will not be available in the public domain. So there are certain limiting factors on the cash flow side, possibly because management is not giving you the information. It just says that it's a confidential thing. Go and try to do a valuation of one of the listed company and call a CFO of the listed company and say that, sir, can you give me the projections of the company? The CFO of the listed company would say that, no way, I cannot give you the projections of the listed company. Now, if the projections of the listed company are not available, how will you apply the income approach? That becomes the limiting factor. And does it mean that you can never follow the income approach and then you have to use only the market approach? And market approach says whatever is the listed price, just go ahead and sign off it as a fair value. Answer is no. We have been recently appointed by one of the listed company, and then they made this argument. The group of management said that we cannot give the prospective financial information developed by the management because we are a listed client, and then the confidentiality needs to be mentioned. And then I questioned them back saying, I write in my report, the entire content that you share with me remains confidential. So whether the word that I undersign in terms of the confidentiality, does it mean that you don't rely on the oath that we take in terms of keeping your information confidential? And the management was also a chartered accountant. And he said that, I mean, the management senior was also a chartered accountant. And he said, yes, Parag, I understand your apprehension, but we have never given the prospective financial to anybody. And then I had to counter him saying that if you can't give me the prospective financial information, then how will I apply the income approach? And I will not sign your report by saying that your listed price is a fair value, because your listed price is a price and not a value. Your listed price, like I said, could be a market driven conclusion which may have factored some of the panic, or which could be overvalued, which could be undervalued. I don't know. It's just a conclusion out of demand and supply, which is one of the way of looking at it and calling it as a fair value, but not a conclusive way of looking at it and then concluding it as a fair value. Finally, the conclusion of value. When you are valuing an asset, specifically an equity interest, the 100% value of the equity interest represents the controlling value. And then less than 20% or less than 50% potentially represents the non-controlling value. So please ensure that you are correctly applying the discount for lack of marketability and discount for lack of control when you are valuing the non-controlling stake of unlisted company. And I have seen some of the valuers saying that I have assumed the discount for lack of marketability as 30%. Now, can he assume that? No, he cannot. And then I have seen some other valuers saying that I cannot identify the discount for lack of marketability. So he says it's a limiting factor. And that's why he assumed 30% on an arbitrary basis to be discount as a discount on lack of marketability. Can he do that? Answer is no. You would see people around you doing such kind of practices arbitrarily. And is it correct to follow arbitrary conclusions? Answer is no. There is a scientific way of calculating the discount on lack of marketability and discount on lack of control. And if you don't follow it, and if you try to write a language as if it's a limiting factor, then it is not acceptable. Rather, it will be treated as a professional negligence. And finally, the reporting and documentation, which needs to be decision centric. That is, if you are doing it for the further issue of shares, is it for compliance purpose, is it for deal making, along with a detailed sensitivity analysis. So like I said, now at this juncture, we have just delved into the overall process driven valuation. I have yet to touch upon and speak on the detailed guidance which flows around the caveats, limitations, and disclaimers in this particular process. So in general, valuation is required for what all purposes? It is possibly required for acquisition, disposal, merger, amalgamation, could be for internal decision making, could be for corporate governance. Sometimes it is under the regulatory compliance of Companies Act, SEBI regulation, income tax, Foreign Exchange Management Act. Sometimes it is for fund mobilization, such as equity or convertible instruments, along with the put options, etc. And sometimes they can also be a part of dispute resolution, maybe within the court or outside the court. And many times in the recent past, because of the COVID activity, we have also seen the valuation work increasing on the borrowing and lending decisions. Ultimately, obviously, for the insolvency proceedings, also the valuations are required. So, like I said, in the recent past, there has been a public concern on valuation and its impact on the company shareholders. And I cannot forget the example of Paytm. I have been shouting to people around that you cannot just be you cannot have the herd mentality. If everyone is running behind and investing in a company, you just invest because your peer has invested. You can't do that. You need to analyze yourself. And the company, in his report, which is filed with its prospectus with the IPO, says that you may not expect the positive profits or the positive cash profits in the near future. And despite that, people go out and invest and ask for X value. The question is whether IBBI is also looking at the merchant bankers, whether the authorities are also looking at the merchant bankers, or is it only registered valuer that is getting regulated and we're understanding the fair value. So I'm just making it as a note, or maybe just a passing remark. And I believe that the authorities who are listening to today's remark take some note around it. So the fund mobilization, corporate restructuring, banks and financial institutions are all concerned at the sharp dip in the valuation of assets of these borrowers, or maybe the stressed accounts. and these stressed accounts ultimately become non-performing. And then when they try to analyze why they became non-performing, they ultimately look at the collaterals, and the collaterals valued by the valuers. Now, you and I, we are the financial valuers, financial asset valuers, but there are many other colleagues who do the non-financial asset valuation, such as plant and machinery valuation and land and building valuation. Now, these peers and these colleagues, they face the brunt of these authorities, and the authorities ultimately pass a civil and criminal charges saying that the valuation what they performed was erroneous, it was wrong, because the liquidation value what they get is compared with the fair value that they use for the analysis of the security coverage. So on the one hand, you use the security coverage ratio on the basis of the fair value, and on the other hand, when the asset becomes a non-performing, you identify the liquidation value, and then you compare this value and then put a valuer behind the bar saying, you must be charged with the civil suit or the criminal suit. So in order to protect such valuers, ultimately, it's really good that the IBB and the RBOs came together and came up with these guidelines. A detailed and fully reasoned valuation report should be prepared in every case of valuation done in respect of both mandatory and discretionary valuation. If you are a registered valuer and if you are issuing the valuation report for a discretion, which means not under the Companies Act, should you follow valuation standard and are you governed by your RVO? Answer is yes. Your RVO and valuation standard are the guidelines, or they are the authority in terms of you performing any valuation. So I look at it as a twofold engagement. One, the calculation engagement, where you don't issue the report, then obviously you're not within the ambit of any regulation. Valuation report within the rules or for the discretion or for the management purpose. If you are issuing report for a particular law, you are governed not only by law, but also by the RVO and the guidance. If you are issuing the report for the management purpose, don't be under impression that you don't have any kind of responsibility. You are governed by the ethical code of conduct. You are governed by the professional conduct. You are governed by the valuation standards. Though you are not governed under the Companies Act or under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Act, you are still governed by the RVOs and its code of conduct. So if in performing the discretionary engagements, if you represent something as a limiting factor, and if it is more on account of your professional negligence, then you will be held accountable. Let's look at now some of the contents of the valuation report that typically we have. And why I say this, because if you miss some of the content on the basis of limiting factor, you should mention that, okay, I have missed it because I had limiting conditions, or a disclaim of forming an opinion on this. So I'll tell you, typically a valuation report that I issue, what is the content that I have? First is the background information of the asset that is being valued. Second is the purpose and the appointing authority. Third, most important, the basis of value. And I discussed the basis of value when I was looking at that, the 8-point chart where I showed you the process driven valuation. As you see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can see here the valuation basis. And I have quoted 3 valuation bases: the fair value, the market participant specific value, and the liquidation value. Then once you identify the base, you go and identify the premise of value. Then identify who you are and the experts involved. So you must mention in your report about your background, what expertise you have, what experience you have, and you must also mention the name and the background of each expert who is working with you. You must also write the intended use and the users of the valuation report. You should disclose if there is any interest or a conflict. Obviously, if there is a conflict of interest, then you lose your independence and you can't issue the report for the compliance purpose, but you still can issue the report if it's on the discretionary part, which means for a deal making, it's okay if you are an interested party. Then you must write the date of appointment, the valuation date, and the date of report. Finally, you should write in detail about the inspections and the investigations that you have undertaken, the business interest and the ownership, the nature and sources of information, significant assumptions that you use, procedures adopted in carrying out the valuation, and also mention the valuation standard that you have followed. I encourage you to use the ICAI valuation standard. Then finally comes the restrictions on use of report and then major factors that were taken into account during the valuation. Like I said, until here, I'm covering the first part of my valuation report. After that, I write the conclusion. And one thing which I also add, which is typically not suggested, but I also add the executive summary at the beginning of the report. So I have the executive summary, then everything that I said, then I write the conclusion, and then I write caveats, limitations, and disclaimer before I add a lot many annexures for the calculations and explanations. What typical activities that I perform, which I cannot call as a part of limitation, which I cannot call as a part of caveat or disclaimer. I must perform activities such as I must review the past financial statements. I must review and analyze the financial projections or the prospective financial information developed by the company. I must perform the industry analysis. I must do the SWOT analysis, because this is how, I'm trying to build the overall perspective. I must compare the similar transaction that have happened in the space. I must compare other similar entities, similar listed companies. Now, we also do the comparison of some of the private companies. And why we do that? Because if a private company is not compared, and if I'm comparing with, the listed companies, when I do the valuation of private company, then I am possibly looking at a conglomerate which represents more than one industry. Look at a software private limited company which works into a product. Can I compare it with the Infosys? Answer is not. I cannot compare it with the Infosys, because Infosys is not pure product driven company. And can I say that no, I have a limitation of not having a listed company which is purely a product company? I cannot say that. I must look into another private limited company database, and then I possibly should analyze the margins. Then I should possibly analyze the revenue growth and the industry growth. So that's how, we need to overall look at it. Then we have to also sit across with the management and discuss in detail about the purpose, the growth, etc. The revenue growth, the types of product it has, the dissimilar growth that it imagines in one set of a revenue stream vis-a-vis another set of revenue stream, and likewise. Sometimes it happens that certain business opportunities are time being, and then the growth in the immediate past cannot be replicated in the future. But all these analysis should happen in the discussion with the management. And I recommend that you please write down the notes, share it with the management over email, that as the minutes of the meeting, and let them acknowledge that, so that you put everything on record. And then you can't say tomorrow that no, the manager, this was one of the limiting factor. Now, after that, we should also talk about assumptions made for internal condition that must be stated, like in case of maybe the desktop valuation, or we must state the basis of the report on the basis of, maybe you can go out and click the photographs of the the land that you are adding it as a non-operating asset, or maybe you can click the photograph of the non-operating assets or an inventory which proves the existence. Okay, so obviously you are expected to look at the legal documentation of the ownership, but you are also expected to visit those premises to understand whether that particular land or that particular property has been destructed. I strongly recommend to involve another registered valuer, maybe for land. If I'm doing the valuation of a company which has, let's say, additional land, so though I follow the income approach and the market approach, and I'll be issuing the report on the equity value of the company, the equity value of the company is a combination of the operating assets and non-operating assets. So in that case, typically I will request management to have on board another registered valuer who is who is entitled to perform the valuation of that land or a non-operative building, and then I add that value into my valuation while I finalize my valuation report. We have, as a valuer, need to get, yeah. हो रहा है अभी? अच्छा नहीं था बीच में? Is it still visible? Is it still visible? Is it fine? Okay. Just interrupt me when it is not visible. Sometimes you need to just move the cursor. That's it. Yeah. Okay. Right. Having said that, I was saying we need to give the affirmative statement that the information provided and assumption used by the management or all those, who are developing the projections have been appropriately reviewed. If we just give the statement, I have relied on the prospective financial information submitted by the management, and then what I did was only use the discount rate, to calculate the present value and then call that present value as a fair value, then it's my professional negligence. So while I limit my responsibility, I cannot detach myself from a liability to review the prospective financial information. And when I say review, I do not mean view, I mean review. So if the management gives you the prospective information, and if you look at it and say, okay, then it just, you are viewing the financial information. Review means the analytical part attached with it. So for example, when we do valuations for private limited companies, like I said, we look at the comparable listed as well as unlisted peers. And that's where you need to question if the asset turnover ratio of your comparable company is, let's say, 2:1. And maybe, let me quote an example. So in one of the startup company, a good profit making company, a management comes to me and say that, sir, I believe the revenue growth of my company would be so much. I asked him back the question that, are you increasing your capital for the purpose of investment in the fixed asset? It was a manufacturing company, by the way, so capital intensive company. So he said that, no, we have the existing capacity, and existing, we are running at a 40% level. We have the capacity. So, we are just simply doubling the production, and the demand is also there. So we believe that there is no additional fixed asset investment is required. And that's why you can very well consider the revenue is well within the capacity of the company. Now, when I looked at the comparable companies, all other companies, okay, when I did the calculation of their revenue, and when I compared that revenue divided by the fixed asset, the long-term fixed assets, it's basically the fixed asset turnover ratio. I realized that all of them are clocking revenue of approximately 50% of the value of their fixed assets, and they have been clocking such 50% of the revenue for almost last 6-7 years, and all these were comparable companies. So the obvious question is, they must also be having, let's say, the additional capacity. Look at, let's say, the sugar factories, okay, or maybe similar kind of businesses. You might have capacity, but there may not be demand, or there may not be a production. And just because you have the capacity, if management comes in and says that I'm going to double up my revenue, and I'm going to, this is how my growth needs to be captured in my valuation, then I think we must doubt. That's a review, basically. So it's not mere analyzing what is the capacity of the company and looking at the projections. Rather, looking at the projections analytically and doing the comparable analysis is what is expected. And then you cannot just write in the limiting factor that the management has given the financial statement, and I have done my valuation on that basis. So if you have done valuation on that basis, it's a management's valuation. It is not the fair value computed by the registered value, right? So I think this was a very critical issue in terms of calling something as a limiting factor and not calling something as a limiting factor. And that's why I thought to bring to your notice how the affirmative explicit statement is required in terms of the information provided and assumptions used by the management and others who have developed the financial projections that you have appropriately reviewed. You must also state that you have made the inquiries regarding the key assumptions in context of business that has been valued, and you have looked at the global outlook and the industry outlook. Rather, I also encourage that you must also include as a part of your report the global outlook and industry outlook before you conclude on the valuation. Okay, now let's move ahead. Okay, in terms of example or the common practices that we use in actually quoting something as a caveat or a disclaimer. First, let me give you the explanation of these three words. Rajesh sir has actually explained the meaning of these three words, and I think, but let's reiterate because we all have been using them interchangeably. So let's try to first understand the meaning of these three words. First word is caveat. What are caveats? Caveat are warnings or cautions to the client or user of services. Okay, let's quote an example of the caveat. So if I am doing a valuation of a company whose land has been valued by another valuer, then I must warn the client. See, I will review the registered valuer's report, but I'm not responsible for physically going and checking whether the land is existed, because it is the responsibility of the another valuer, right? Then I must warn about it. I must make, it's a cautious kind of conclusion or cautious reference that I must make, that, okay, I rely on the expertise of my peer registered valuer, but I'm just giving you the warning that the overall valuation could be sensitive to the conclusions that I've drawn from his report. Okay. Now, second, let's look at the limiting factor or the limitation. What is a limitation? Limitation is a restriction on the scope of registered value. So, to quote an example, let's say you cannot visit some area because, or maybe you are doing a valuation of a companies like L&T, who also play a vital role in defense manufacturing. Now, there could be a limitation on your part that you may not be able to visit those areas, or you may not be able to get very detailed information around those areas. But what you get is maybe information that could be apparently sufficient to say that, okay, the value could be equivalent to the cost, and then cost can be undersigned as a fair value. But it's a limiting factor. And you must brought to the notice of the reader that, okay, this is a restriction that I had. I could not go and check the or could not have an ability to physically verify the tenacity or the impairment of those particular assets, or maybe some of the documents, like if it's the legal document of the ownership of a company could be, if it has been mortgaged, then the original deeds could be with the banks, and what you get is the true copy of it. But then you must mention it as a limiting factor, that you have not reviewed the original copy but as a true copy. And why you must explicitly mention it as a limiting factor? Because if you don't mention it, and if tomorrow if the case of Satyam and Mitas happen, when the Satyam never owned those lands, okay, and the lands were owned in the Mitas, okay, when the Satyam never owned those lands, when the Satyam never had those fixed deposits in the banks, okay, and if you have not reviewed even the true copies, and if you have not issued explicitly written as a limiting factor, then obviously you will be charged with the professional negligence. Now, third word, disclaimer. Now, we have already we already know the word disclaimer because we had the auditing background, and SS 700 have given the word disclaimer, saying that when you can't do things, you just disclaim from taking any responsibilities. So disclaimer is what? Disclaimer is a statement that is intended to specify or delimit the scope of rights and obligations that may be exercised and enforced by the parties in a legally recognized relationship. So if you cannot do certain things, you just disclaim from doing it. For example, you have been asking for the management to give you certain data, and if the management is not giving you that data at all, you say that in my executive summary, in my conclusion, I'm going to say that the value derived is not a fair value, and I disclaim myself from opining on the fair valuation. If you believe that, you can still call that to be a fair value because it will not result in any material misstatement. No problem. You understand that value as a fair value, but then still you disclaim from saying that, I could not review 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I disclaim on offering my opinion on the fair value on these particular areas. So while caveat, limitations, and disclaimers have different connotations in the context of valuation, these clauses have been used interchangeably, primarily to say it's a limitation or a disclaimer by the registered value. So it is imperative that the users of the report are familiarized about the same to enable them to assess the impact of these disclaimers, caveats, and limitations on the credibility and the reliability of the report. Right. So I think I tried referring to each of these 12 different areas in my discussion. I still have last 10 minutes before I conclude on my my closing remark. So registered valuer has right to demand relevant information. You have all right to ask for the basis, such as the pricing strategy. You have right to ask for if the revenue growth is there, how the fixed asset investment could be made. If the fixed asset investment could be made at X price or X value, you should ask for the quotes or the comparable quotes from the market, and the management should be able to supply you with those quotes. For example, if you want to increase the capacity of the company, and that's why you want to install, let's say, machine A and machine B. So machine A and machine B value has been identified as a cash outflow in the prospective financial information. You have all right to ask the basis of that number, and the management should in turn respond to you by quoting, let's say, the quote from the suppliers, or maybe you can go and check the quotes, maybe apparent quotes, and then check the comparability of the numbers assumed by the management and the numbers that are quoted by the potential supplier in its quotation. Lastly, there could be a range of value that can be concluded as an estimate, and it is one of the key difference between ICAI valuation standard and international valuation standard. So ICAI valuation standard allows you to quote range of value as a range of fair valuation, or basically range of the value estimate to be called as any value around these two values could be considered to be a fair value. But having said that, you cannot have that range open-ended, or you cannot have that range which represents a fundamentally radical gap. Obviously, then we are losing the sanctity of the fairness of that value if we do so. We must talk in detail about the factors affecting the report, such as in recent times, we heavily written paragraphs on the COVID-19 and its impact on an industry, because the projections are all subject to the market opening up. In 2019-20 reports, I remember somewhere in March 2020, we had the projected financial information which showed the growth from year 2000, mid of 2021-22. Now, whether such kind of growth has happened, answer is yes. I'm fortunate that the growth has actually happened, and when we go back and try to reconcile those numbers, I believe that the management had done their good homework in terms of anticipating the future growth. But now when the new virus strain is on the verge of explosion, Omicron, I think we all are in a limbo. We are in a dilemma. What is going to happen? Will there be restrictions? Will there not be restrictions, etc.? And just assume for a fact that if the restrictions come in, look at the airline industry or the tourism industry. Even if, let's say, there are no restrictions in terms of the number of flights, but if there are restrictions on number of passengers, or look at the event management company or entertainment industry, when there are no restrictions on opening up the cinema halls, but if there is continued restrictions on the number of people who can be go and visit that movie, then obviously the projections that you made in 2019-20, in hindsight today, that they're wrong, right? And then if tomorrow the tax authority or a SEBI or any other authority comes in, or let's say the investor comes in and says that you have done a wrong job of doing a valuation in 1920, giving the projections at so much value and thereby calculating number. Just imagine if I have not included the limiting factor paragraph, I'll be responsible for the professional negligence. So we don't know exactly how things will happen in the near future, in midterm and in long term. And that's why these balanced language of the caveats and the disclaimer play a vital role in protecting you from your legal liabilities. External data. If you are using external data without quoting those references, you are responsible for unethical practices. I see many registered valuers copy pasting data from the internet, which is basically the research carried by some of the big organizations. Now, it is your limiting factor that you don't have resources to go out and carry the research. And if you are using somebody else's research that should be a paid research and quoting it, then I think that's a dangerous move. So better you pay and buy that research and then absolutely go ahead and quote it. There are certain researches, if you go and read their last pages, you will read that the research can be quoted in your report, provided that the credit is given to the person or the entity that has carried the research. And imagine a situation if, let's say, one of the big research organization has carried a research and quoted that it believes, let's say, 20% growth in AI and ML sector, artificial intelligence and machine learning companies, or let's say 30% growth. And if you use it as one of the critical assumption, should you not write it as a limiting factor that you cannot imagine what growth there could be in immediate future or the midterm, and you have relied on the research performed by another company? It is also one of the limiting factor, right? So you must give due credit to people who have carried the research. You must talk about the credibility of that research. You must write the commentary on you reviewing that research and accepting as a part of the valid assumption. And then finally, you should also comment on the sensitivity of the input that has been used from that particular research. So the external data needs to be reviewed, thoroughly analyzed. If there's a limiting factor, should be explicitly written. And then the conclusion of the value should come with that caveat saying that, okay, it is also subject to some sensitivity. Last but not the least, when we issue the valuation report, we must explicitly mention that our services are restricted to the use of this valuation report only. If tomorrow we have been invited to give a testimony or attendance in the court, that will be charged separately and that will be altogether separate service. Can court use our report? Answer is yes. But if court wants you to defend that valuation, then I strongly suggest that when you do the engagement letter, you mention that the professional fees that you are charging are for the reporting purpose only and not for the explanation to the court. And subsequently, if the court asks you, then the out-of-pocket expenses and per visit expenses, you need to charge to the client. If the lawyers have right to get their fees on the basis of each standing that they have in the court, I believe that you also have right to charge for the pleas, because what you do is defend the value that you undersign as a fair value. I think with this, we are almost at the lag end of the discussion. I give finally the conclusion of the value. I give my comments finally on the conclusion of the value. I still believe that the disclaimer, caveats, and limitations do not detach you from giving high quality view on the fair valuation. You must ultimately build up that number which represents a faithful conclusion, which represents not a biased conclusion towards investor side or investee side, or not a biased conclusion towards the authority which appoints you. I remember when I was doing a chartered accountancy course, a person came to me and said that, chartered accountants are known for a particular fact. If you go to a science student and you ask him how much is 1 + 1, he will say 2. And if you go to chartered accountant, then he will not say 2. He will say, how much do you want? Now, this how much do you want kind of thing is good in terms of identifying the synergy, bringing that synergy, quantifying that synergy. But trust me, 1 + 1 cannot be 11. Even the chartered accountant should not say that, right? So, in Pune we say that कोई दूध दे रहा है तो दूध में पानी थोड़ा डालता है तो भी उसको दूध ही कहते हैं, बराबर है. पर अगर आप पानी में दूध डाल के थोड़ा उसको आप दूध करके बेचोगे तो वो गलत है. So in that sense, you must not be biased towards absolute wrong things. Rather, your value should be neutral. And you must have the assertion of the completeness in order to conclude that value to be a high quality conclusion. I believe that one of my principals said that, Parag, independence is a trait of an individual. Independence derives from the brain and your thinking. So let me quote another example. While I was doing another engagement, just before concluding the appointment letter, the management and CFO of the company passed a remark, Parag, I believe that the valuation could be around 30 crores. And when I left the room, now I was biased towards the 30 crore number that has been quoted by the management in the lag end of our meet when I received an appointment. I went back, I did my valuation. The valuation was around 12 crore of rupees. And I believed that I am wrong because the management said the valuation could be around 30 crore. I reviewed my number, I reviewed my calculation more than 5 times. And then ultimately realized that I was biased just because of the passing remark made by the CFO of the company. So like I said, when you go in the room and deal and negotiate on an engagement, ensure that you come out with an independent mind. You exercise with an independent mind. You may face certain limitations, it's okay, but don't lose the independence. Lastly, value must be concluded in a context, and don't conclude market driven prices which are market participant specific or could be the listed price as the fair value. With this, I conclude on today's discussion, and I open up today's floor for any question and answers. Over to Sehgal sir.
Thank you, sir, for your presentation.
Yeah, I hope I stopped exactly at 4:30 within time limit.
Yeah. Sehgal sir must be joining in some time.
Okay.
Yeah. Sehgal sir, you may take up questions, please.
Yeah. Well, to be very honest, the questions which I have received possibly that rather mystifies or demystifies the complexity of the subject. So let me start with the easiest one. It says which standard should be followed doing valuation. So I think your comment on this.
Yeah. So, in terms of the valuation, first of all, like I always recommend, if you are ICAI RVO registered member, you must use ICAI valuation standards. If you are not ICAI registered valuer, I recommend you use ICAI valuation standard because there is no other national standard that is present in India or has been issued by any other professional body. All other professional bodies are possibly referring to international valuation standard. But why I recommend ICAI valuation standard? The reason is that ICAI valuation standards are customized for the Indian context. They are customized for South Asian economies. They give you a liberty. They empower you with some of the intricacies which are not dealt by international valuation standard. And basically, like I said, they are made by imagining the challenges which are typically faced by Indians. So my first preference is to use ICAI valuation standard. If you follow ICAI valuation standard, trust me, you are also more than 95% in compliance with international valuation standard, except for the fact that ICAI valuation standard allows you to give you more than one value as a range of fair values, whereas the international valuation standard requires you to conclude on a specific value as a fair value. So apart from that, there are some other valuation standard that typically I use that are issued by AICPA and USAPP or RICS, but they are recommendatory in nature, and you can always, for your academic interest, look into these other valuation standards.
Thank you, Parag. Parag, you touched upon the conception of material uncertainty. Now, in terms of this being a proposition to be used as a disclaimer or limitation without dilution of responsibilities. So if by way of an example, you could illustrate that what could be a material uncertainty?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And let me try to quote it in terms of an example. Imagine a startup company which is funded by a known startup, by a known VC, right? And maybe they're ahead of time. The business has not picked up. And imagine situations such as virtual realities. Now the company is working closely with hospitals and some of the other medical devices company, or where the doctor is able to imagine his patient or look at the patient through the virtual reality, and then try to perform the operation by accessing the 5G, sitting in India doing operation in Bhutan, or sitting in China doing operations in USA, as the case may be. Question is whether such operations, which ultimately they are critical to the human life, will be allowed under the rules and regulations of the national standard. So whether company is performing activities into a possible new scientific innovation, answer is yes. Is it technically feasible? Conclusion, yes, it has proven it. That's why PEs have invested in it, and it is still evolving. So we have the technical capabilities, we have analyzed the commercial possibilities, and if the commercial possibilities are viable, and they are in that sense, even the economic feasibility has been proven, which means it has certain value. But the uncertainty lies around the legal structure of allowing doctors to perform such kind of operations remotely. Now that uncertainty, if it is there, as a valuer, if you are valuing companies with similar business models, how would you quantify such uncertainty? And you need to imagine whether such operations will take place in 2025 or 2023 or 2030. Will it be possible for you to have these operations possible in a given country or not possible, etc.? And in that case, you make to have certain assumptions, and when you perform these assumptions, you are basically limited by this potential legal threat, and then it's a material uncertainty which is not possible to be quantified. So you do the valuation, you say it's fair value with an underlying assumption that maybe the operations will be commercialized from 2025 onwards, etc. But then you say that I have this, I also disclaim, or there is a caveat in terms of the restrictions that I have. So I hope I was able to give an example which fits the scenario that you asked around material uncertainty.
Thank you. In terms of the scope of work, whether what was wanted by the seeker can be extended by the valuer to enhance the value of the report.
Yes, rather the bare minimum content of the report must be fulfilled, and it requires lot many activities to be performed by the valuer. I received a message couple of hours back saying that valuer has been asked to comment only on a share exchange ratio typically used for the merger scheme, and the client doesn't want the valuation report, the detailed valuation report. So the client says, I'm ready to pay you X amount of fees because I just need your comment on the share exchange ratio, which is already agreed between the parties, and I don't want a detailed valuation report, so you please charge me less amount. Answer is, irrespective of the fact whether you agree to those fees or not, because fee is your prerogative. Scope of work is not your prerogative. Scope of work, the minimum content needs to be built up, and for building up that minimum content, what is the analysis has to be given, has to be done with. When you are issuing something as a report or as an opinion, it should fulfill the valuation report minimum standard guidelines. Having said that, if the minimum content requirement needs to be supplemented with something that enhances the quality of report, obviously that is your prerogative. And if I were you, I would do that, because we are, if you want to stay in this profession for a long term, and if you could imagine the potential use by a specific authority, let's say by the court or by the investor, then I would travel an extra mile and try to include those areas which basically gives warnings, those areas which basically gives analysis that can caution the incoming investor or incoming authority around particular areas of the work, instead of just disclaiming myself from saying I don't know about it.
Thank you. In fact, there is another question which is vis-a-vis the audit report, and the question is, if there are some qualifications in the audit report which could affect the valuation, what should be the role of the valuer?
So very good question again. We cannot assume that the historical financial statements, when are bad, then the prospective financial statements can be good. Rather, there is a valid reason to doubt the veracity and the reasonability of the prospective financial information built by the client. If you are using the historical record and applying, let's say, the EBITDA multiple on the historical revenue, or the revenue multiple on the historical revenue, or EBITDA multiple on the historical EBITDA, etc., then they need to be rectified. If the qualification says that the profit is understated or overstated, that needs a rectification to be used for the potential multiple to ultimately calculate a value. If the qualification says that there are certain revenues which are not accounted with Ind AS 115 or etc., then obviously you cannot use the revenue multiple, because these are not reliable set of multiples. Or you can use then the prospective financial information, and then you have all doubt to question the validity of the projections made, which means you are expected to go a little deeper. And I think if you perform the financial assertions validly, then still you can overcome the qualification of the historical records and will still be able to certify a value as a fair value.
Now, another question is around the time gap between the conduct of valuation and valuation report. And related to this is another question which says that supposedly there is a mega positive event after the date of the valuation. So should that also form part of the report?
Yeah, I think the answers lies in a concept of adjusting and non-adjusting event. I'll first answer the second question. If the mega positive event happens after the date of valuation, should it be a form of your valuation report? Answer is yes. Should it be a part of your valuation? No. Let me repeat myself. If there is a mega positive event after the valuation date, should it be the form of your valuation report? Okay. Should it be the part of your valuation report? Answer is yes. Should it be the part of your valuation? Answer is no, which means let's assume that as of 31st of March, you're performing the valuation and you issue the report by 30th of April. Now, mega positive event has happened somewhere by 10th of April, that is after 31st of March, that is after the valuation date, but before you issue the report. Now, whether that particular event should be a part of your valuation report? Answer is yes, because you say that the valuation has been concluded on the basis of facts which were present as of 31st of March. But that fair value may be understated, okay, in today's date because of the positive event that has happened. So you go ahead and try to write optimistically that, the positive events that have happened post the valuation date have not been factored in the valuation. If they were factored, then you have two choices. Either you quantify and say the valuation could have been more by so much amount, but you are not under obligation to quantify that particular valuation. So we treat it as a non-adjusting event, and that's how you deal with a non-adjusting event by disclosing it. In terms of a time gap, you need to analyze whether these are adjusting or non-adjusting event. If something has happened before the valuation date, obviously you need to treat them as an adjusting event. Now, something has happened historically, but the conclusion of which results after the valuation date, but before the valuation report date, then obviously it is treated as an adjusting event because you were not able to quantify it as of valuation date, but the fact was present as of the valuation date. And now you are able to quantify it before issuing the valuation report for a fact which was present as of valuation date. Then obviously you go back and then you quantify it and then you include it in your calculation. One of the classic example is something which was imagined as a contingent liability as of 31st of March concludes to be a liability subsequently in a day or two. Obviously needs a quantification in the valuation. I urge all valuers that if you are performing the valuation on the basis of the prospective financial information, perfectly fine, go ahead and use it, check the validity, but don't forget to look at the historical financial statements where the auditor has undersigned and the management has disclosed the contingent liability. Somewhere you need to quantify that contingent liability in the prospective financial information. And if it has not been quantified, then the commentary is needed around it. If it has been quantified, ensure the quantification is correct. It is neither undervalued nor overvalued.
Well, the next question possibly arises out of subsection 3 of 247 in terms of the standards of professional misfeasance or malfeasance. So the question is, how do you escape the judicial testing or liability if a limitation clause can be possible, stating the efforts put in by the valuer as a safeguard?
I like the verb that has been used in the question. The verb is, how do you escape? I think I will rather use another verb, embrace, instead of escape. Embrace the limitations, embrace the disclaimer. Don't try to escape from something. Rather, because you can't escape, you need to mention something explicitly. And like I said, mere mentioning something explicitly doesn't give you an escape route from your professional requirement. So ensure that, question yourself, question your heart and conscience. Are you negligent in performing your duties? And I think duties have been well discussed throughout the session of last 1 hour. I said that there are certain things which have to be done. It must be done. The empirical study must be carried, must be carried. You can't just say that management has not given me and still I believe something to be a fair value. There are only two possibilities. Either you as a valuer believe something to be a fair value, or you don't believe something to be a fair value. If you believe something to be a fair value, despite that limitation, then I think you can absorb it in your professional capacity. But other people and authorities have ability to question. So it is on to your part to prove that how you believed something to be a fair value, when in true sense, it's not fair because you are limited by something. And the other possibility is you don't believe to be a fair value, but the management is pressurizing you to sign something as a fair value. In that case, obviously, if I were you, I will not sign it off as a fair value. I think as a professional, we are strong. Our institute is strong. And if you don't keep our head high, and if we don't possess an ability to say no to management, who possibly also belong to our institute, they will not learn to respect us. So in that sense, please respect yourself, please respect the profession, and in a larger interest to maintain the integrity of profession, I would say, don't escape, embrace the rules, try to be a part of the rule.
Another question, it has come by way of an example. It says that supposedly a company has invested 100% in equity of one infra SPV, and
Okay.
that SPV has taken loan from bank, and the company stood as corporate guarantor. Project of the company was terminated. Under concession agreement, the SPV company is entitled to termination payment, which is 100% of debt and 150% of equity. This payment is disputed by the in the tribunal. Now the question is, can the equity be valued on the basis of termination payment receivable in future, and how to deal where value is upon adjudication of a dispute?
Yeah, answer is yes. ICAI valuation standard empowers you to use the liquidation value, termination value, because it's a special purpose vehicle. So it is basically built up for a particular purpose. If the purpose has been served, or if purpose is not to be served, then obviously what happens is the liquidation event. So I will still call something, this process as a approach towards the liquidation valuation. Secondly, the liquidation values can be a fair value in that context because it is conceived as the only value by all market participants, whether by authority or by the adjudicating authority, or by the bank lending institute, or by the SPV owners institute. In terms of the corporate guarantee that has been given, you need to check if the corporate guarantee may get invoked, and it could be dual. One is the financial guarantee, second is the performance guarantee. If the work has not been done, then obviously the performance guarantee will get invoked, and then as a valuer need to value it, and then ultimately provide for the liability in the company which has offered the guarantee. The company which receives the guarantee will also liquidate its asset, because it has to pay back the loan of the bank, right? So it all depends exactly for whom you are doing the valuation. But I would say, as a valuation profession, we are truly empowered by the valuation standard to perform valuation and call something as a fair value, despite the business challenges faced by the client or the investing company.
Paragji, by and large, the questions have been covered. So what is your concluding remark to the attendees, and whether they are members of the valuation profession or the others, how they should be dealing around this subject? One, to enhance the credibility of the professional work, and second, taking due safeguards, and of course, because these are big ticket items, and in posterity, what kind of questions are going to be raised, nobody can predict. Nobody can predict the level of uncertainty. You can see the context today, or maybe on the basis of the information generally available. But the risk dimension may be more. So what is your suggestion to the professionals?
I think I would say that I sit in the same boat. I don't look myself as someone who is sitting at a hierarchically higher level. Neither you, Sehgal sir. I think as a ICAI RBO, it's more like a socially driven engagement that all of you are carrying in terms of these knowledge dissemination sessions, and the sharing of experiences in turn help us. We learn from each other. I'm also learning from seniors in the profession. I think this learning process should continue. The debate and deliberation should be continued. The podium must be used for a better purpose in order to advocate the needs and challenges of the profession. They must also be used for advocating the better practices. But the professionals around us should take it in true spirit. All valuations are to be carried out in a sufficient detail to comply with the requirement of what we say as a due care. However, it can be reasonably expected that circumstances may place certain limitations regarding access to information, or maybe including the time available, because I know that as of 31st March, bankers come in, the derivative valuations are there, or some of the financial instruments to be valued, specifically of those listed companies, the public sector companies, and they need to sign off their treasury audits, etc. by 10th of April. Or even the NPAs sometimes need to be valued, or some of the NBFCs, they need the valuation for their investments, because these are not held to maturity investments but held for trading investments, and etc. So keeping in view of the business needs and circumstances, my last concluding remark would be the interest of the transparency and any significant concerns regarding the justification or the information or time available to complete that valuation engagement needs to be stated in the valuation report, together with the explanations and the implications in detail. If we fail to do that, possibly we end up signing a value. It may be a fair value, but then we are failing to exercise professional due diligence in carrying our activities, or sometimes we end up carrying due diligence correctly, but not articulating it in detail in the report. So as a registered valuer, it is my responsibility. I have the responsibility to the authority, to the client that appointed me under the terms of those engagement letters. And as a professional, I should ensure that I should not misrepresent, or I should not have any willful default on a part of activities that I follow. If we are working within the framework of law, I think we should not fear of anything. And this law has given a true strength in performing our valuations, irrespective of any management or professional challenge that we have. The great source or the great strength that we have is our ability to form our opinion and write around it, whether a disclaimer of opinion, whether opinion with limitations and caveats, or opinion suggesting something to be a true fair value. Thank you so much.
Parag sir, very well explained, and in fact that sums up the entire exercise, in the sense that the entire objective behind the conduct of this program was empowering and learning from each other's experience, and possibly with each experience sharing, we enhance that moat around us of the capability and the dexterity which is required in the marketplace, given the complexities of the overall scenario. I must bring to the notice of all the people who are listening to this webinar that ICAI RBO has come out with a stakeholder engagement survey, in which we are wanting, and that survey is available online and it is in the form of a Google form. So the more we hear from you on your problems, challenges while you do the evaluations, possibly, and the level of services being rendered by ICAI RBO. So it will allow us to improve further and possibly take up some of the contentious issues or issues which would require the attention of the government or the regulators. So with this, I would request Sarika ji to conclude this program and propose vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Rajesh Gupta, sir. On behalf of ICAI RBO, we would like to thank Rajesh Gupta, sir, to spare his valuable time and to address the registered valuers. Parag Kulkarni, sir, as usual, your presentation was wonderful. The way you have presented this guidelines in 10 slides, I don't think anyone could have done it. In 10 slides, you have explained this huge guidelines and big responsibility on the valuers. And also like to thank, we have 4,200 people associated with us who are watching live the session from, as I also mentioned, from US, Canada, New Zealand, Singapore. Singapore has also been added now. And of course, from all parts of our country. Thank you so much, sir. We will keep continuing this kind of conducting this kind of sessions under Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. We look forward for another sessions and look forward to this kind of participation from all the people. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Sehgal sir. Thank you, Kulkarni sir. Thank you, Rajesh Gupta sir. Thank you, all of you.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.